When Lincoln Met Euclid by Gary Taylor, Chapter 2. Lincoln speaks Euclidean often. Abraham Lincoln was somehow aware before he read Euclid's Elements that he should read it. He was also somehow aware of why he should read it. I'm not sure how he knew this. Perhaps he had read that the philosopher John Locke recommended studying Euclid for reasons other than becoming a mathematician. In fact, he likely came across the name Euclid often in his own self-education journey. Abraham Lincoln is the ultimate role model for self-education. By Lincoln's own account, the whole of his schooling didn't amount to one full year when all the pieces were added together. No high school diploma, no college, just a year's worth of grammar school spread over a period of several years. In those days, teachers would come to the frontier towns and stay for a short while and then move on. Most of the teachers had a minimal education themselves. Lincoln learned to read, write, and do some basic arithmetic in school. From that foundation, he was able to educate himself by reading and rereading, often out loud. He said reading out loud helped him to take in information with two senses. And he committed much of what he read to memory. There may have also been a bit of luck involved in that the few books available to him in the libraries of the early 19th century Western frontier were some of the greatest books ever written by that time. He was a huge fan of Shakespeare and Robert Burns, and he read a biography of George Washington called The Life of Washington by Parson Weems. At one point, he studied to become a surveyor and earned at least part of his living that way for a while. And this might have been inspired by reading about Washington, who also spent time as a surveyor. Prior to becoming a surveyor, Lincoln read two books on surveying, each likely referring to Euclid and each certainly addressing geometry. Lincoln was also profoundly interested in the founding fathers and was likely to have come across Euclid's name in those readings as well. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin were all admirers of Euclid, and there's some evidence that George Washington was as well. By Lincoln's time, Euclid's Elements was second only to the Bible in number of editions published since the first printing in 1482. It has been called the most famous textbook of all time. So there were plenty of opportunities for Lincoln to have heard of Euclid. And, of course, surveying certainly required some knowledge of geometry. But Lincoln knew that he should study Euclid for reasons other than knowing the geometry. Again, he was somehow aware that he should study it to understand this art of demonstrating. And understanding the art of demonstrating was something he believed was necessary to becoming a good lawyer. So Abraham Lincoln read Euclid to become a better lawyer. This is important enough to restate. This great man studied geometry to become a better lawyer and to improve his powers of language and logic. Let's look at some of his own words to verify this. The following is an excerpt from an autobiographical piece that Lincoln wrote for a presidential campaign pamphlet. In it, he refers to himself in third person. In my research, I have noticed that in some instances, this entire paragraph is attributed to Lincoln, and in others, part of it is attributed to Lincoln and part to his Springfield, Illinois law partner, William Herndon. The first sentence belongs to Lincoln in all accounts. For our purposes here, the point is that he studied Euclid to improve his powers of logic and language. The second article that I will present after this one will make it abundantly clear that this was Lincoln's desire. So, from a short autobiography for presidential campaign pamphlet. He, again that's Lincoln in third person, he studied and nearly mastered the 6 books of Euclid since he was a member of Congress. He began a course of rigid mental discipline with the intent to improve his faculties, especially his powers of logic and language. Hence his fondness for Euclid, which he carried with him on the circuit till he could demonstrate with ease all the propositions in the 6 books, often studying far into the night with a candle near his pillow, while his fellow lawyers, half a dozen in a room, filled the air with interminable snoring. That's the end of the passage. So it appears that Lincoln committed the Euclidean proofs to memory, but it is also apparent that he was convinced by these proofs. I believe both points are significant. More on both of these points later. Also note that these stated reasons for studying Euclid had nothing to do with geometry. The next article was published in the New York Times in 1864. The interview was conducted back in 1860. Now, 1864 would be about when he's running for his second term. But the original interview was conducted back in 1860, although the article says 1861. But all other accounts I could find say 1860. But the interview was conducted on a train ride shortly after Lincoln's famous Cooper Union speech, and shortly before he was nominated for president. Lincoln was well known for his way of putting things. While this is bound to be a reference to his ability to have a ready-made, often humorous, story for every occasion, and for his frontier-style colloquialisms, it also refers to the thorough and convincing manner in which he could make his case, whatever the case may be. Many historians believe the Cooper Union speech was the most significant factor in winning him the nomination for the presidency in 1860. That speech, which will be included later in this book, is a textbook example of Euclidean-style axiomatic demonstration applied to something other than geometry. So, Mr. Lincoln's early life, how he educated himself, from the New York Times, published September 4th, 1864. Reverend J.P. Gulliver details in this week's Independent, I'm assuming that's some kind of a supplement to the New York Times, a conversation which he had with Mr. Lincoln as long ago as 1861. Again, all other accounts say this was 1860. In the course of the conversation, Mr. Gulliver remarked, quote, "I want very much to know how you got this unusual power of putting things. It must have been a matter of education. No man has it by nature alone. What has your education been?" Lincoln: "Well, as to education, the newspapers are correct. I never went to school more than 6 months in my life. But as you say, this must be a product of culture in some form. I've been putting the question you asked me to myself while you've been talking. I can say this, that among my earliest recollections, I remember how, when a mere child, I used to get irritated when anybody talked to me in a way I could not understand. I don't think I ever got angry at anything else in my life. But that always disturbed my temper and has ever since. I can remember going to my little bedroom after hearing the neighbors talk of an evening with my father, and spending no small part of the night walking up and down and trying to make out what was the exact meaning of some of their, to me, dark sayings. I could not sleep, though I often tried to. When I got on such a hunt after an idea until I had caught it. And when I thought I had got it, I was not satisfied until I had repeated it over and over, until I had put it in language plain enough, as I thought, for any boy I knew to comprehend. This was a kind of passion with me, and it has stuck by me, for I am never easy now when I am handling a thought, till I have bounded it north and bounded it south and bounded it east and bounded it west. Perhaps that accounts for the characteristic you observe in my speeches, though I never put the two things together before. Mr. Gulliver says, Mr. Lincoln, I thank you for this. It is the most splendid educational fact I ever happened upon. This is genius, with all its impulsive, inspiring, dominating power over the mind of its possessor, developed by education into talent, with its uniformity, its permanence, and its disciplined strength, always ready, always available, never capricious. The highest possession of the human intellect. This guy must have liked Lincoln. But let me ask, did you not have a law education? How did you prepare for your profession? Lincoln, oh yes, I read law, as the phrase is. That is, I became a lawyer's clerk in Springfield and copied tedious documents and picked up what I could of law in the intervals of other work. But your question reminds me of a bit of education I had, which I am bound in honesty to mention. In the course of my law reading, I constantly came upon the word demonstrate. I thought at first that I understood its meaning, but soon became satisfied that I did not. I said to myself, what do I do when I demonstrate more than when I reason or prove? How does demonstration differ from any other proof? I consulted Webster's dictionary. That told of certain proof, proof beyond the possibility of doubt. But I could form no idea what sort of proof that was. I thought a great many things were proved beyond the possibility of doubt, without recourse to any such extraordinary process of reasoning as I understood demonstration to be. I consulted all the dictionaries and books of reference I could find, but with no better results. You might as well have defined blue to a blind man. At last I said, Lincoln, you can never make a lawyer if you do not understand what demonstrate means. And I left my situation in Springfield, went home to my father's house, and I stayed there till I could give any propositions in the 6 books of Euclid at sight. Then I found out what demonstrate means and went back to my law studies. These are my words now. Here, Lincoln makes the case for studying Euclid, and he states that it applied to practicing law. He didn't study it in order to use the geometric results. He studied it to learn the meaning of demonstrate as it applied to law. And notice that this is the only part of his law education that he discusses in detail. Notice also that he says he found out what demonstrate means by studying Euclid. What might Lincoln mean by that? I think it is this. Euclid's proofs convinced Lincoln. Euclid had demonstrated the truth of each proposition to Lincoln. Lincoln learned the necessary steps to making a convincing case because Euclid's method worked on Lincoln. He was convinced. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, notice that he does not claim to know what demonstrate means until after he could give any of the propositions in the 6 books of Euclid at sight. A casual reading of Euclid does not do the trick. The moment he fully understood each proof and was convinced by the proof was the moment that he could do the proof himself. The interview goes on. Mr. Gulliver says, I could not refrain from saying I could not refrain from saying, in my admiration of such a development of character and genius combined, Mr. Lincoln, your success is no longer a marvel. It is the legitimate result of adequate causes. You deserve it all, and a great deal more. If you will permit me, I would like to use this fact publicly. It will be most valuable in inciting our young men to that patient, classical, and mathematical culture which most minds absolutely require. No man can talk well unless he is able, first of all, to define to himself what he is talking about. Euclid, well studied, would free the world of half its calamities by banishing half the nonsense which now deludes and curses it. I have often thought that Euclid would be one of the best books to put on the catalog of the Tract Society if they could only get people to read it. It would be a means of grace. I think so, said Lincoln, laughing. I vote for Euclid. That's the end of the article, and back to my words. So Lincoln votes for Euclid. Lincoln had voting on the mind when this interview was first conducted in 1860. He was hoping to be nominated to be his party's candidate for president. And, of course, he was hoping to then be elected president. This is Lincoln's endorsement for studying Euclid for reasons other than learning about triangles and other geometric figures. And again, Lincoln seems to consider it a major part of his education as a lawyer, perhaps the major part. Note the words of the journalist himself saying, Euclid, if well studied, would free the world of half its calamities. Lincoln apparently agrees. The author also complains that it would be difficult to get people to read Euclid. It would probably be even more difficult today, but perhaps even more important to try. The presentation of the reasoning techniques studied in Euclid can be revamped for contemporary readers. The first consideration for contemporary readers, as previously stated, is to introduce the technique through arithmetic rather than geometry. This approach will be defended a little later in this book. In addition to being aware that he should read Euclid, I think Lincoln was aware that he should study Euclid. Again, a casual reading would not suffice. Knowing what axiomatic reasoning is not enough to understand its power. From the above article, I get the impression that Lincoln already owned a copy of Euclid and had some knowledge of what was in it. Lincoln says, quote, I left my situation in Springfield, went home to my father's house, and stayed there till I could give any propositions in the 6 books of Euclid at sight. I then found out what demonstrate means and went back to my law studies. End quote. So going to his father's house would not have been because his father owned a copy of Euclid. Euclid's father, Thomas Lincoln, was not an educated man. He could neither read nor write and apparently had no interest in books at all. Lincoln was not close to his father. At least one reason for that, and likely the main reason, is that Thomas Lincoln believed his son, Abraham, was always reading to get out of working. He thought his son was being lazy when he was reading, that he was wasting time. Thomas Lincoln really could not have even begun to understand the value of all that reading. He likely thought of it more as entertainment, like watching TV would be in later years. When I was a kid, I was supposed to finish my homework before I could watch television. To Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's homework would not have involved reading, but would have been physical labor on the family farm or being hired out to work for neighbors. Reading was keeping him from his work. Reading was not working. It was something you did in your spare time. But most people who knew Abraham in his younger days said they never saw him without a book. He was constantly reading. He believed it was valuable and was going to help give him a better life than that of his father. There may have been other reasons for the distant relationship between father and son, but this seems to be an important one, if not the primary one. All of this is to say that Lincoln must have gone to his father's house simply because that is where his own copy of Euclid's Elements was. And if this is true, he must have had some idea of what was in the book and that it might help him learn to demonstrate as a lawyer would. Recall that he had been a surveyor and was possibly somewhat familiar with what was in the book from that study, and perhaps that is why he owned a copy. But note again that simply reading it was not enough. He might have read it before, but it was only when he could give any of the propositions in the 6 books of Euclid at sight that he claims to have understood. To master Euclid takes time. Lincoln must have worked with each proof until, using his own words, he bounded it north and bounded it south and bounded it east and bounded it west. When Lincoln was president, he preferred not to speak extemporaneously. I think it is because he needed time to think about what he was going to say. He believed in being thorough. His speeches were often for the purpose of demonstrating well-developed ideas. His prepared speeches were works of art in so many ways, but particularly in his ability to make his case, just like a lawyer making his case. Lincoln often treats his speeches like a Euclidean proof. Ronald C. White, Jr., author of The Eloquent President, states that prior to the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln had used the word proposition nearly 300 times in previous speeches and letters. In Euclid, a proposition is a statement that is to be proved. Once proved, they become theorems. Axioms, as we have noted, are statements that are assumed to be true without proof. They are considered self-evident. Lincoln uses the word proposition the way Euclid does. These many uses of the word are further evidence that Lincoln was profoundly influenced by having studied Euclid. Of course, he uses the word again in the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So, both Jefferson and Lincoln used Euclidean words and a Euclidean theme for this statement, all men are created equal. Jefferson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Whereas Lincoln says, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. There is a bit of irony here. Jefferson, a slaveholder, albeit one who is somewhat ashamed of it, gives the statement self-evident status, axiom status. But Lincoln, who was thoroughly anti-slavery, realizes with immense sadness that this great civil war, as he called it later in the speech, is being fought because many do not see the statement as self-evident. For them, it is not an axiom. Therefore, Lincoln uses the Euclidean word proposition, something that is to be proved, even though he himself believes it should be self-evident. Lincoln knew that there would have been no war if all men are created equal was self-evident to everyone. In most of Lincoln's pre-presidential speeches, particularly the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he states plainly that the difference in the two sides is simply, we think slavery wrong, they think it right. He has stated that the two sides agree on first principles, he has stated that the two sides disagree on first principles, that is, on axioms. In this case, in order to agree, one side would need to convince the other side that their axiom was false, that the other side's axiom was false. In the previous discussion, I used the word axiom, whereas English translations of Euclid use the word postulate. For our purposes, they are synonyms. Historically, they have been used both as true synonyms sometimes and near synonyms at other times. I will use the word axiom throughout. In 1693, John Locke wrote the following. When he, a student, has once got such an acquaintance with the globes, celestial bodies, as is above mentioned, he may be fit to be tried in a little geometry, wherein I think the first 6 books of Euclid enough for him to be taught. English statesman and philosopher Sir John Bolingbroke wrote this about John Locke. Mr. Locke, I think, recommends the study of geometry even to those who have no design to be geometricians, and he gives a reason for it. Such persons may forget every problem that has been proposed, and every solution that they or others have given. But the habit of pursuing long trains of ideas will remain with them, and they will pierce through the mazes of sophism and discover a latent truth, where persons who have not this habit will never find it. So here we see that John Locke recommends the study of geometry, meaning the first 6 books of Euclid, even to those who aren't going to be geometricians. And this was exactly what Lincoln did. Lincoln studied Euclid with no intent of being a geometrician or even using the geometry. The takeaway for Lincoln was not the circles and triangles and squares of geometry, but rather the axiomatic reasoning process, or the practice of demonstrating, as he put it. The next excerpt is from the 4th Lincoln-Douglas debate. Lincoln is referring to Stephen Douglas when he uses the pronoun he in this excerpt. Douglas, an Illinois senator, had accused Lyman Trumbull, the other senator from Illinois, of lying. These are Lincoln's words now. If he, Douglas, will explain his action on this question by giving a better reason for the facts that happened than he has done, it will be satisfactory. But until he does that, until he gives a better or more plausible reason than he has offered against the evidence in the case, I suggest to him it will not avail him at all that he swells himself up, takes on dignity, and calls people liars. Why, sir, there is not a word in Trumbull's speech that depends on Trumbull's veracity at all. He has only arrayed the evidence and told you what follows as a matter of reasoning. There is not a statement in the whole speech that depends on Trumbull's word. If you have ever studied geometry, you remember that by a course of reasoning, Euclid proves that all the angles in a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. Euclid has shown you how to work it out. Now, if you undertake to disprove that proposition and to show that it is erroneous, would you prove it to be false by calling Euclid a liar? That's the end of Lincoln's words, and now this is my words. This is an interesting Lincoln quote where, once again, Lincoln praises Euclid. According to Lincoln, Trumbull's honesty had no relevance in the particular situation, since Trumbull had demonstrated in the Euclidean sense the truth of his argument based on the evidence. The evidence acts as the axioms in this case. Douglas had no counter-demonstration, and so simply resorted to calling Trumbull a liar. Next, we have an excerpt from a speech made in 1859 in Columbus, Ohio. This time, my notes will be written in black within the excerpt. To read the article without the interruption of these notes, simply read the part that is in blue. For this reading of the book, and you won't be able to tell when it's in blue ink or black ink, so I'll just say Lincoln's words, then my words. I'll go back and forth. So these are Lincoln's words. There are 2 ways of establishing a proposition. One is by trying to demonstrate it upon reason, and the other is to show that great men in former times have thought so, and thus to pass it by the weight of pure authority. My words. Proposition, demonstrate, reason. He used all 3 of those words in that. In fact, I'll say it again. There are 2 ways of establishing a proposition. One is by trying to demonstrate it upon reason, and the other is to There are 2 ways of establishing a proposition. One is by trying to demonstrate it upon reason, and the other is to show that great men have thought of it. So proposition, demonstrate, and reason, all words that Lincoln associates with Euclid. Lincoln believes that in order to establish a proposition, you try to demonstrate it upon reason. To Lincoln, demonstrating a proposition upon Lincoln means to demonstrate it in a Euclidean fashion, as is evident in his next sentence, which I'll get to. We shall see from articles of both Alexander Hamilton and Albert Einstein that they too believed this is the way to establish a proposition. Hamilton writing approximately 70 years before the above Lincoln excerpt, and Einstein over 80 years after the Lincoln excerpt. Lincoln does allow for the additional possibility that you can show that the proposition has already been established by respected thinkers of the past, which is what Stephen Douglas was claiming in this instance. But Lincoln disagrees with Douglas. He believes that the respected thinkers to which Douglas referred did not agree with Douglas. Back to Lincoln's words now. Now, if Judge Douglas will demonstrate somehow that this is popular sovereignty. Let me pause. Popular sovereignty was a phrase for what Douglas was trying to get people to understand. It was what he used to say that a locale should be able to pick for themselves whether or not to have slavery. I kind of botched that, so let me just state it again. Here's Lincoln's words. Now, if Judge Douglas will demonstrate somehow that this is popular sovereignty, the right of one man to make a slave of another without any right in that other or anyone else to object, demonstrate it as Euclid demonstrated propositions, there is no objection. My words. So he challenges Stephen Douglas to prove in the Euclidean fashion this proposition that popular sovereignty gives one man the right to enslave another without the right of anyone else to object. Back to Lincoln's words. But when he comes forward seeking to carry a principle by bringing it to the authority of men who themselves utterly repudiate that principle, I ask that he shall not be permitted to do it. My words. Douglas had stated that the founding fathers believed the above proposition, but Lincoln claims they did not, and gives much evidence that they did not in the rest of this speech, and even more in his famous Cooper Union speech, also known as the Cooper Institute speech. And we'll look at that speech in a little later. From these texts, we see that Lincoln was indeed very familiar with the 6 books of Euclid, and often referred to Euclid in his written work and speeches. Next is an excerpt from a letter to Henry L. Pierce and others, that's how it was addressed, from 1859, so this is before he was president, in which Lincoln refers to Euclid yet again. Lincoln was declining, due to his busy schedule, an offer to speak at a Boston festival celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday. Pierce and others were on the committee that had invited Lincoln. Excerpt. Lincoln's words. One would, and this is not from the very beginning of the letter. This is on into the letter. One would start with great confidence that he could convince any sane child that the simpler propositions of Euclid are true. But nevertheless, he would fail utterly with one who should deny the definitions and axioms. The principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of free society, and yet they are denied and evaded with no small show of success. My words. Note here that Lincoln calls Jefferson's principles the definitions and axioms of free society. But in the Gettysburg Address, 4 years later, he calls them propositions because he knows that to some they are still not self-evident. That is, still not axioms. Back to Lincoln's words. One, and he's talking about one of these